May, and we're just going to move through the SOMP. Not a lot has changed at all in the overall format of the SOMP, but we've changed a little bit in how we've designed it to try to make sure that we're tracking the information well. So this is a chance to get some feedback from you on that, and also just, if you have any questions and experiences with filling it in. So as you know, the SOMP, I'm trying to get rid of, there we go. Sorry, I had a big blob in the middle. Okay, so the SOMP is a summary of measurement table, and it's nicknamed the SOMP. And what we're trying to do with that is have a standardized way of reporting each of our measurement properties and the review that we've done on it, so that our results around a given instrument can be more transparent, that we can get access to all the key decision making and all the studies that were considered in making a decision, and that our decision making, sort of the algorithms and processes, are clear, so that people will understand how we came to that decision about a given instrument. Hopefully, like the onion, it will become sort of a recognizable, accessible KT tool for everyone to use, which will be just the one-stop shop. And to be clear, it's not replacing the detailed reporting of the reviews, etc. So it's just really the one-page summary, sort of like the onion for domains. So how does it support working groups? So we've always been designing the SOMP with working groups in mind, because we think we want it to be a tracking tool so that it's keeping track of what steps you are at in the instrument process and the whole. It's a huge process, as you know. So the literature reviews take a lot of time. You're managing a lot of information. So we thought a tracking tool would help you understand, okay, we've done this. This is how we've got this far. We haven't got risk of bias done on this one. So you'll be able to keep track of all of that using the SOMP. And it also keeps track of things like the dates for your literature review. So if you go to do a future update, you'll have this one-page summary that says, and this is the literature that we'd search for this summary, and you can move on from there. So as a tracking tool for the working groups, but also for communication at that ratification vote, because we as a community have decided that at the end of an instrument selection process, the working group is making a recommendation about an instrument, and that comes to the OMERACT community, often virtually now, for a ratification vote. And the SOMP will be, again, a recognizable pattern thing that we can get used to seeing and get used to processing, so that we can see how conclusions were made to get to that ratification vote. So let me orient you to the SOMP. And the first thing you'll notice is that we now have sort of 3 sections divided by blue bars. And the top section is sort of the background, the PICO. What instrument are you actually looking at? What version? What is your domain definition that you're supposed to be able to measure with this instrument? And some of the background information on the population, the typical interventions, and how you want to be able to use this. It also, in this section, tracks some of the information that we'll go over in a little bit more detail that has led up to this step. The middle is where you have your review findings. So each row is a contributing study or resource for the evidence that you're considering, and each of the columns are the measurement properties that are critical to what OMERACT considers passing the filter. And then the bottom section is where we come to conclusions about the synthesis, about the findings, and how we're tracking those using the different colors. And so now what we'll do is we'll move through building this SOMP. But it's important to remember that there's a lot that's gone on before we hit the SOMP. The early steps are already done. So you've already looked for domain match and feasibility, and you've set aside instruments that are not feasible or not a match to your domain. And so really what we're doing here is trying to only look at the instruments that are moving through to full review. But the first thing you're going to track is the fact that your group has already done the truth and the domain match and feasibility. So we're asking you to put that in here and put a date with that so that we can find those resources and reports of those. So what we're really trying to look at now is reviewing the evidence. So passing the filter means that we have consistent, good performance on key measurement properties in a similar context of use. So similar patients, similar types of interventions being considered. And so what we need to gather that evidence is a review of the studies that were done to test these measurement properties in similar enough populations. And when we think about the key measurement properties, these are the key measurement properties in the filter. So we have our construct or hypothesis testing validity, inter-method reliability, which might be between raters or between machines, responsiveness, longitudinal construct validity, reliability test retest, discrimination in a clinical trial setting, and then documenting some meaningful thresholds, be they change or states, like a patient acceptable symptom state or a remission state. Before you get to the SOMP as well, you've already done this, and we're not diminishing the amount of work that goes into actually finding the evidence. So you've done a search of the literature, you've screened them, you've done your selection, and now you have your set of articles that are going to be providing you with some measurement evidence. And what we ask you to do is, as you get to that final state of selection, a good thing to do is to extract which measurement properties were actually done in each of the studies that you've identified in your selection. So again, in the SOMP, there's a section up at the top where you can document which databases did you look at and what windows of time did you search, so that it'll be easy to pick up and update this at a future date. And then you begin to populate your SOMP. So place the studies in the rows, and those studies, if there's 10 studies, then that should match the final box on your PRISMA statement about how many studies were found that included evidence. And then start putting X's in each of the cells under the measurement properties that were reviewed in each of those studies. So it gives you already a sense of the body of literature that is going to be used in your decision-making and where there are actually any gaps. And the first thing it's doing already is avoiding some selective reporting bias, because you've done a search, you've done your selection process, and now you can start to see the lay of the land where all the evidence should be. Theoretically, you could even stop here. We don't recommend it at all. It's giving you an inventory of the evidence, obvious gaps. Is it worth continuing? But this does not say what was found in any of these studies. And the SOMP is, what it is being is really clear about what has been done. And that's what we tried to say the whole way through. We want it to be clear about what was done, what wasn't done. So clearly here, risk of bias hasn't been done. You haven't looked at the results of the studies. You're just getting a sense of the number of studies that are out there. The next step in our process is to do a quality of methods check. And that's usually the next step in any typical systematic review, where the method's good enough to avoid bias in their estimation of the measurement property. So this is our risk of bias assessment. And OMERACT has the good methods checklist. There's a lot of different checklists out there, but the one that we're recommending is the good methods checklist, which really is saying, has the study done good enough methods to avoid any fatal flaws? And we color code. So red would be, we think that it has maybe not been able to avoid a fatal flaw, so we're going to give it a red. Amber means go ahead, proceed with caution. There might be some things that were unclear, or you want to be a bit cautious about the study, but it's still a go ahead. And green is that it's good to go. It's avoided the risks of bias. Now, the important things with this is we've decided as a group that when there is a high risk of bias, the fatal flaw, then you don't need to go further with those cells because you're trying to diminish their impact on your overall synthesis. So they're still on the table, but you don't need to they won't be included in the synthesis. So what's happening now is that you're moving from the plain background to now a colored background, which is your risk of bias. The X's are still the same. And what we're doing at the bottom is keeping a tally of the number of pieces of evidence available for a given decision for each measurement property. So under test, retest, reliability, you see that there were 3 sources of evidence. One of them has come up with a high risk of bias. And so we're now saying that we have 2 pieces of evidence that we feel confident using in our synthesis step. And that's the minimum that we want. We want at least 2 studies per property that are of good enough quality. And this might be a step at which you say, okay, we need as a group to do another study on test, retest, reliability. And you could get that going now, early in the game, so that you can keep your process moving. So the next step is to look at the results of the study. So how did the instrument actually perform? And were the results good enough? Like, did the actual study show that this instrument had good enough reliability? And at this stage, we're changing the X's to reflect the results of the study. So we used a literature review, and I'll show you a bit of that on the next slide, to set provisional standards for what good enough reliability or good enough validity is. And you assign a plus to the cell to say that it's met or exceeded that level of that standard, a minus that it did not achieve it, and a plus or minus if it's equivocal or perhaps there's multiple theories being tested and you're getting equivocal findings. So to decide on the provisional standards, we did a review of the systematic reviews that had been done in the literature, and this is in conjunction with a group called the BOSS Group, Best Outcome Selection Study Group, that's based in Toronto. And we did a review to say what are the standards for construct validity, and for all the measurement properties. But just as an example, for construct validity, there's over 40 different standards for demonstrating good enough validity. And these are just a few that I've blown up. By no means do we expect you to go through them, but we can make these available to you if you want. And so based on these standards, we reviewed each of them and said, okay, here's a provisional standard for OMERACT. But this is something that we will be going back to as a community to decide on what are the best standards. So you could stop here. You would have an overview of the literature. It would include quality. It includes the results, but there's no formal synthesis. Or you could have skipped the quality check and had a list of the evidence, location of evidence for each property, the results of the studies, but there's no synthesis. And then there's no quality appraisal. But again, at least in the SOMP, it's clear. And I would say that in the literature, this is what a lot of the literature is showing. So it's not doing sort of the quality of the methods. And so we're really thinking that the quality of the methods is an important contribution to the reviews as well as the synthesis. So then let's go on to that synthesis step, because this is where you're really saying this is the decision that we made. So we're looking for consistent results from good quality studies. So meaning we need 2 or more studies, good enough quality, and consistent positive findings. And we ask you to rate each of the measurement property columns, and you'll have a profile then across. So if you have that, 2 studies, good enough quality, consistent positive findings, you would get a green. If you had negative findings, those consistent negative findings, then you would be getting a red. So it's an indication of no, don't go here. This instrument does not have good retest reliability, for example. And in between, you might have some amber ratings. And the one that's also there is a gray rating, which means that in this column, it was inter-method reliability, and that may not have been applicable for this instrument in this setting. And the other one that you might find across here is a white. And white means that there was just no evidence available for this measurement property given this PICO. And so what you'd do then is you'd have to build that body of evidence. So red and white means you can't continue, but the green and amber mean go ahead. Amber, of course, we'd want to understand what we could do to improve that. So for the whole instrument then, once you get that really important profile done across each of the measurement properties, it's a simple algorithm to move into the final endorsement. If you have solid greens, you can get a full endorsement recommendation, and that would be a green box at the bottom saying, we're recommending that this is fully endorsed. If it's a mixture of amber and green, which a lot of them have been so far, you're going to end up with an amber level endorsement, provisionally endorsed, with a statement about what needs to happen. So more work is needed on retest reliability and threshold of meaning. And again, if there's red or white boxes in your profile, then you're going to be having to say that it's not yet ready for endorsement. Either things need to be fixed, or else you need to create some evidence that's missing. So that's how you're ending up building your summary of measurement properties table, so that we get that standardized reporting of each of the measurement properties and all the evidence we're considering, that we're providing transparency in our findings, access to the key information, and clarity around the decision-making algorithms that went into the final decision-making for your final recommendation. So it is a tracking process. It's clarity of what's being done, a reporting of the results. it likely fits, we've targeted OMERACT needs and the goals around having a tracking tool and having this communication tool. But it also could be something that people find useful, for example, in a grant or in theses or reports. So it could well fit needs beyond OMERACT, but our goal was to make sure that OMERACT had the tool that it needed to. Okay, so that's that. And there are some resources and articles that'll be available to you, but maybe what I'll do is stop sharing right now and just see about questions or thoughts.
Thank you, Dorcas. Questions?
Dorcas, I have a question just, about the inter-method reliability in terms of testing for that. And, I guess an example of that would be if you have a computerized administration versus a paper administration. Yeah. And I'm just wondering what the rationale is behind needing two studies to show a property like that, pretty much for every instrument that's ever been done for, the results have really shown no difference. And what do we think we're going to gain out of having to have two studies that have been published for that? Because that is not a small issue of doing a study to show that reliability. And, it seems to me that we're going to have potentially a lot of either whites or things that are amber because they only have one of those. One study may have been published on that, but really for something like that is almost, I don't know of any study that's ever shown that, the administration of something on a computerized version has shown a difference than the administration on a paper questionnaire. That, why are we setting such a high bar for a measurement property like that I just wonder whether we're investing a lot of resource, energy, and time into generating something that may not actually be that important.
That's an excellent question. And so there's a couple of things. If it's not an important source of variability, so if we can, as a community, say, this is not an important source of variability, we know we can go between paper and computer without it affecting the measurement properties and our decision-making about an instrument, then it might not be an inter-method issue. It could just be something we just understand. Inter-method issues are around, I'm like right off the top of my mind, I'm thinking of BMD testing machines are highly variable, or sometimes observers in ultrasound will give different readings for the same testing situation, so that you would want to test and sort of standardize the way people are doing certain procedures. If inter-method doesn't, if there's a body of literature out there that's similar enough to your patient population that's saying that you've got it, it's stable, then I would say it's not, you don't have to go and study that.
I just wonder if it's worth our making a caveat that says that this applies to image, this may be one of those things that is more applicable to imaging rather than people that are administering questionnaires.
It'll also pick up when we start doing, there's some groups that are doing not only imaging, but some of the performance-based assessments, and it'll certainly pick up in that as well.
Yeah, but I think we need to recognize that for all types of questions, this may not be applicable. And like I said,
certainly the example we had was for,
yeah, but your example was probably just administering that on a paper questionnaire. But I'm thinking this paper versus computer administration issue, that we probably shouldn't set a barrier to groups to have to generate data to prove that, since that's been so.
What we should maybe do is make a little bit of an FAQ statement about why, like, that there's enough literature out there already, that people should think about this literature first before they embark on a study and see if this is enough evidence. Because I agree, if it's already been studied really well and there's no reason why it should be any different results in this population, then that would be a really important resource for people. It is a big study, you're right.
Good suggestion. We'll definitely do that. Ernest?
Oh, yeah. Just following on what Bing is saying and Dorcas' explanation, I guess what this raises is what is the definition of inter-method validation?
Good.
What does inter-method really mean? Is it a statistical analysis? Is it different context, but the context is defined by the pickle statement. So I'm just trying to work out what is the definition of that? What would be regarded as a valid inter-method study?
Right. So the inter-method is sort of a placeholder that we've said for important sources of variability. So if you had two testing machines and you're wondering whether or not they give the same, like two testing machines, can they give the same results? That would be an inter-method. Or if you and I were doing joint counts, then we might do inter-rater, and that would be a form of inter-method. So it's sort of inter-blank reliability. We know we've got test retest over with change, and this is sort of saying, are there any other sources of variability that we should be testing out to be confident that we can get consistent numbers out of this measurement? So inter-method, inter-machine, inter-rater. The telephone versus paper was a big one for a while because they were getting different results when interviewers were interviewing by telephone than if you mailed them a mailed survey.
Yeah. I'm still a little bit confused because if you do a joint count and you give it to 5 observer and do the same joint count, that gives you a number, and the standard error capture that variation in measurement. So
Yes.
That's not really an inter-method, that's the variability in the measurement, isn't it?
Yes. And so what you're doing in an example that you've done, you had concerns about the inter-observer reliability with your joint count. And so you're going to do the average of 5 to overcome that and to get an estimation of what that variability, and that it's all random so that you can take care of it with your average. So that's all good. That's the means that you're using to manage. And this study might be the study to see do we have to make a decision about how to manage this variability?
Maybe I can. So if I do a study of doing joint counts in doctors, in rheumatologists, and I do a study of doing the joint count from nurses, would that count as 2 studies?
What is your source of variability? What do you think
So
your source of variability?
I'm still trying to get the granularity of what would be an acceptable definition of 2 studies.
If your source of variability was the professions, that you think nurses and physicians gave different joint counts, then doing a study in physicians over here and nurses over here wouldn't be addressing that inter-profession variability that you're concerned about. So you would need to do physicians and nurses on the same patients would be the type of study that you'd want. But if your concern is just about inter-observer, like just people, then yes, a study on nurses, a study on physicians could give you an estimation if you don't think the issue is around professional training. But
so let me try a different way. So if you do a rash analysis of items in a questionnaire, and you find that the differential item response, that is an important variability and measurement property of that item. Okay, so you would probably not accept enough diff in an item. So doesn't that do that already rather than doing 2 studies?
If you want to do a rash analysis of your instrument across professions or across all sorts of different things, then that's a way of getting at this inter-method reliability. Yes.
Okay.
And Bing, can I add, is there anything you want to add to that example? Because I know you think a lot about the IRT and the approach.
I don't think, I mean, I think about IRT in terms of questionnaires, not so much in terms of things like joint counts and ultrasounds. So I'm not quite sure how IRT would apply to that.
I think Zahi had Didam also joined. She's going to show her song, but you have to go to clinic soon.
Hi,
Zahi,
everybody.
Can you hold could you hold your question for 1 second while Didam shows her song and then asks her question?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Over to you, because we asked a couple of groups, and as always, the myositis group said they'd be happy to share their SOMP and just questions about it or difficulties or other things. So that's perfect. Thanks, Didam.
Of course. So let me pull up. Hi, everybody. Good morning. So this is what we had in our actually workbook for the promised physical function form. Again, we're myositis groups. Our population is adults with idiopathic inflammatory myopathies. I see that the table looks a little different. Than what you showed, Dorcas, looks actually different, like the truth and feasibility, you have it up there, and you have the truth discrimination, different ones up here, you have the year different, etc. So there's some differences. I guess this is the old version.
Yes, we've just tweaked it to put a few more headings in to make the different sections a bit clearer and stuff. But yeah, it's good. This is still good. You've still got the
It's still
core
perfect.
information there.
Yeah, so for us, mainly the oldest studies that was done about this promised physical function tool is from our group, from the OMERACT status working group. None of the other, not an external group other than OMERACT group has worked on this before. I guess so in terms of clinical trial discrimination, currently the tool is part of 2 clinical trials that we know. But again, we don't have data or results on that yet. So I guess right now, as you know, we finished work on the reliability, validity, and most recently responsiveness and thresholds of meaning. So we have only few studies. So we weren't sure if we are ready to do the synthesis part or the OMERACT endorsement, given that we don't have anything on this column, the clinical trial discrimination, and we only have a few studies that was done only by our group. So I guess my question would be, when do you think groups would be ready to do the synthesis and do the formal OMERACT endorsement?
Great. So you're absolutely right. Without the clinical trial discrimination, you would be getting your synthesis for that measurement property would be a white, because there's an absence of information. It doesn't mean it's not good. None of this means it's not good. It's just that you don't have the information yet. And so that would lead you to saying that it's not yet ready for the overall endorsement. That said, for the other measurement properties, like under your truth, feasibility, construct validity, you could start, you could start doing the synthesis on those cells because you've got your body of evidence there. Are you doing anything more test retest or longitudinal to bump those? Oh, you've got 2 for test retest.
Yes.
Okay, and then because with 1 you'll get an amber because you need you can't really judge the consistency because you've only got the 1 study. But that's okay. Amber still means go ahead. It's not, amber means go ahead. It just means that we'll be watching for, more evidence to be able to move that to the green, but still good. So you could do the synthesis ratings for your other measurement properties, and as your clinical trial comes in, then you'll be able to do your final recommendation.
So
Final understood. Okay.
just a thought too, if your clinical trials are moving ahead, you may be able to also get thresholds of meaning through the trials if you incorporated an anchor in those clinical trials with each assessment. Meaning, if patients had rated their change from baseline, you may be able to understand what minimally important changes are within the context of the clinical trials and the proportion of patients that were reaching those different thresholds. So it is an opportunity if you're missing, you've done the 1 thresholds of meaning study, but that could be integrated within a clinical trial to give you a second piece of evidence for that particular measurement property. Likewise, the longitudinal construct validity, if you had other measures where you could look at hypotheses, could also be obtained from your clinical trial with the appropriate design. So I think, if planning those trials, or if one of them has not yet started in some way, trying to think about how you would have those other anchors in there as well as other measures in there to complete, so that when a clinical trial is done, you have all of the information that you need across the board.
That's a good point. That's a good point. I think in the trials, they don't have the patient-reported anchor directly, categorical anchor, but what they have is this patient-reported global disease activity scale that they will be tracking at every visit. But maybe based on that, we may be able to indirectly say.
The challenge, we've really shown that at least in terms of promise measures, that if you look at a patient global in rheumatoid arthritis, you get different estimates than you do using a symptom-specific anchor. And the FDA, from their perspective, is recommending symptom-specific anchors rather than disease-specific anchors. So, that is a potential, problem for you in terms of misinterpretation of those thresholds, because they do vary according to the specific anchor that you use.
And so being for physical functioning, the symptom-specific anchor would be something around physical functioning?
Yes, so again, they would accept something like a visual analog scale of physical function, and you look at patients that are changing by more than 2 units on a physical function 10-point scale, and call that a meaningful change, but something that you can triangulate against. If you look at the FDA guidance document, again, they show you how to do this using ECDF curves. And we published those ECDF curves for the promise fatigue measure against different anchors of change. But the FDA examples that they give to you are actually not using the anchors of a little, a lot, or the same. They are actually using the examples that the FDA gives, uses things related to I believe what they do is like a 5-point Likert scale in terms of change of more than 2 units on a 5-point Likert scale to be something that's significant. So I just think that, trying to think about how you might be able to buff up those clinical trials to give you those answers that are being sought, and trying to do it in the ways that the regulatory authorities are looking for would probably be good.
Thank you, Ling. Very helpful suggestions. Yeah.
Because then you raised your hand about, right?
Yeah, thanks. It's nice to see this overview as well, and sort of prompted me some queries. So, because being involved in some clinical trials, they've not been published yet, for example, and likely they will not publish the clinical trial discrimination as well in their main manuscript. For the table, could we still say, well, actually, we as a working group will use some of that data and do the analysis, but it will not be published? Or does it always need to be published? Or could we say, well, actually, we're going to use some of the clinical trial data, do the analysis ourselves, and include some of that information later on in the manuscript? Or is that not allowed? Does it really need to be published then?
Great question. Thanks for raising that. We've always said that working groups themselves can create the evidence when there's a gap, and that we would have sort of a backup, either if you have a measurement person you could reach out to, maybe somebody who's not been involved in the analysis, or reaching out to the tag to sort of be a bit of a peer review, arm's length peer review. It's not the same as the publication peer review, but that for our group has been saying, yes, that's enough for us to feel confident without those pieces of evidence. And then we, of course, would encourage you to continue on and publish that.
Okay.
Yeah, it's highly unlikely that people are going to be able to publish a retest reliability paper. It's just not going to get published as a standalone. So I think we have to understand that and recognize that.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Any other questions about that graph? Or SOMP? Zahi, your question, was it about that or because I feel like I skipped you there? Was your question about this, or?
Something related. So my question is, let's say we're working on discriminative measurement property, and we have over the last 10 years or 5 years enough number of studies to show that there is really good evidence around this. Is there a number of studies where we reach saturation, or we do have to continue extracting the data for all available studies?
What an enviable position to be in, that you would have that. You know, we're really trying to push the minimal thresholds, and now you're suggesting that there's times when you have enough to be very confident with your decision making. So, and this is across the profile, Zahi? Like, say you get solid.
No, I'm just thinking about when we get to the work with lupus, because
Right.
I know for a certain instrument, there is enough data to show that a specific tool has really good ability to discriminate between responders and non-responders. And if you look at the last decade, there is more than 20 or even more trials. So the question, do we have to continue looking at all the literature, or we can stop there?
So I can suggest my view of that, and then maybe we can open it up to others for their opinions. So mine would be that you've got your defined PICO up at the top. Sometimes interventions shift. So, you know, even when we started having DMARDs in, the demand on the instruments shifted because we were comparing one to another, so that it was a much finer level of discrimination that we had to have the ability to detect. So if your PICO is the same, and you've got your body of evidence, and you've got enough that it's meeting all these standards, and I wouldn't imagine that something had changed enough to shift your conclusions about an instrument. But if something in your PICO has shifted, the nature of the patients, the nature of the interventions, then you might need to revisit it to confirm it. Any other thoughts? We always ask groups to think about a recheck window, not a full, like to sort of think in 10 years, we should probably revisit instruments, because content validity shifts. We ran into this with the instrument that I support, which is we don't change light bulbs as much as we used to. There's things that shift. We don't have a lot of thumb work in our questionnaire around use of iPhones, so.
Thank you.
Thanks, Marcus. Annalise, you had a question? No, you're muted.
No.
Yeah, she's not muted.
Oh, no, you're
It
not.
might be the selection of her mic.
Oh, no.
In the meantime, there is something from Andrea in the chat while she's sorting. Andrea, did you want to ask your questions?
Yes. This is a question to you. It's a little bit late. I think is regarding the first chart that you presented in the beginning of this session. And just I think 2 points is that one is about data acquisition, because data acquisition maybe is not applicable to all instruments, but may be applicable to imaging instruments, because depending on data acquisition, you may have variability as well. In terms of, I think, calibration of the instrument, also, I think, different manufacturers, generation of machines. So is there a way to take this into consideration in the chart that you presented? This is one question. And I think this is about variability and using that. And the other one is about tools that people may use to assess the quality of methods. I know that in some imaging studies, people also use, instead of assessing the quality of the methods, they assess the quality of the reporting, for example, using the STAR tool. And this is also another point that I wanted just to discuss in terms of being taken into consideration.
Thanks. So I'm just going to, Saidam, could you stop sharing your?
Sure. Sorry.
We might not need, but for your first question, where you're talking about the generation of machine or the manufacturer of a machine for capturing images, perfect examples of that inter-method reliability and the intent of inter-method reliability that you could test and see if there's important variability and bias between machines or between manufacturers. So
Okay.
that was
So
the
it would be
contribution of the,
Liability. Okay.
yeah, yeah,
Okay.
yeah. And then your validity would also be looked at.
Mhm.
Yeah, that would give you that. Now, in
Yes, just
terms-
because there is one term, interpretation. So I just thought, I think, where acquisition would be, because it's not about interpretation, but it's falls into reliability.
yeah,
Okay.
and we know that in imaging, there's a lot of processing before you get to the point where you're saying, okay, this is our measure.
Mhm.
And the SOMP would start at a point where you say, this is our measure. This is the score, this is the number we want to use, or the classification that we want to use to come to a conclusion. And I realize in imaging especially, there's a lot of it, many iterations before you get to the point where you'd be hitting a SOMP.
Okay, no problem.
And your second question is around quality of methods versus quality of reporting of your
Yes.
review and your reliability study. There
Yes.
are almost two different things. Quality of methods is the quality of what was done. What methodology did they use? How, if we use reliability as example, test retest, did they have, what was the time gap between? How did they ascertain that people should have had the same scores on both testing situations, which is how you assess your test retest reliability. So those are all the components of the methods. And did they use the right statistic like an ICC? Those are all the methods. Reporting standards will often be, tell us, make sure you document the time between your testing, make sure you document what statistic you used. So it's sort of like report all these things so that the quality of methods can be assessed. So the reporting standards are often just sort of being, tell us about all these pieces, and then those pieces often match or are very closely aligned with the quality of methods that we want to look at.
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Questions? Couple of things, Dorcas, that a couple of things that people have asked me are, can we use the SOMP for more than the same SOMP for more than one instrument at a time?
So the SOMPs are designed with your PICO up at the top, and that first row is the instrument that's being looked at with this body of evidence. And if you were looking at two different instruments, then you would be mixing all your evidence together. So we're recommending at this point one instrument per SOMP. So if a group is looking at, well, worker productivity and Suzanne, you're looking at multiple different instruments, and each would have their own SOMP, and you'd move through the process. So it's a good way of keeping track of what's available for each of the instruments separately and what conclusion you're making about instrument A versus B to have them separate. Annalise had a question about that.
I don't know. Is my
Yes,
mic working
yes,
now?
it's working now.
Oh,
Yeah,
good.
good.
Yeah.
It's when I switch from Teams to Zoom.
Mhm.
But thank you, Dorcas, for this nice presentation. But I have one short question and one somewhat more extensive related to the question that you just answered. The short question is, you now put the date of the search into the SOMP. And is there anything as you should redo your search, like in Prospero, you register, and after a while they say, oh, these studies are too old, and you have new evidence, and you should integrate the new evidence in your new SOMP?
And in
That's a short
Prospero, what
question.
is it? Is it 10 years or 5 years?
I don't know. It
So-
just occurred to me.
At the end of our process or the end of our protocols, usually we ask people to name their revisit. Like, when as a working group are you going to start re-looking at these instruments to make sure that the content validity is still there, to make sure that there's no other things that might be interfering with the measurement properties or how it's performing. So we do ask for a revisit window. So this would at least be a way of documenting if the group said, we'll relook at these tools in 5 years or in 10 years, then this would be able to allow them to say, okay, then 2023 is this search, so we need to be setting up time or thought to review this in 2033.
Thank you. My main question is actually on synthesis, and on synthesis in the context of you have for for one domain, you're testing several instruments. And let's say you have construct validity, and you are extracting data on construct validity of, let's say, 2 instruments. And for one of these instruments, you have 7 articles, 2 of which have, let's say they are all green, and 2 of which have a plus, and the others have a minus because they did not fulfill 75% of the hypothesis. For the other instrument, you have only 2 studies, and they are all green, and they both have a plus. But and in this case, you would endorse for that property, you would endorse the study with 2 studies, and you would not endorse the one with the 7 studies. And what was interesting was that the studies where we had the instrument with the 2 studies, they were also part of the study where we had 7 studies. So we endorsed one with fewer studies, and we rejected the one with more studies, but they had as external standard for their construct validity, very different, a lot more and very different external standards, and just made the wrong hypothesis. So synthesis is not always as
I agree.
straightforward.
I think you make a really good point, Annalise, though, about the hypotheses, because they are hypotheses, and very frequently, when I've seen groups do this, they overestimate what the effects are going to be, and that seems to be consistently done, so that groups miss their overarching thing. And I actually think that it's important for us to get out a message to people to underestimate what the strength of the relationships are going to be, so that the hypotheses are met. Because, I think that this is a frequent problem, and it's not a matter of the instrument not working. It's just a matter of the hypotheses were overestimated for people. And we have great instruments that fail on that basis, both for construct validity as well as for longitudinal construct validity with responsiveness, especially with responsiveness, where we have very limited information for a new instrument about how it's going to perform vis-a-vis another instrument where even the responsiveness may not be that great for it if you put it up against different hypotheses. I think this whole idea that you have to meet the 75% of hypotheses, again, we've seen that proven wrong time after time after time because people make the wrong hypotheses. And it's not that I just worry that we throw out a lot of good things because people just overestimate what they think the relationships are going to be.
Yeah, thank you. And what do you think about, we have now several examples, and what do you think about appraising as a group the overall construct validity across studies for that instrument? Do you understand what I mean? That when you follow the recommendations, the 75% is not reached. But can we appraise this as an OMERACT group of specialists in this field? And because the hypotheses are made, or we also thought, we are going to say if the hypothesis is better than hypothesized, we accept. Then, of course, it becomes over the 2 studies of the 2 instruments came closer to each other. But in the end, if you appraise what you see, perhaps you can overrule the hypotheses that were made or something.
Or perhaps we could, if we look to our colleagues at Cosman, something that we've done before too is to say, let's look at the hypotheses and maybe even prioritize amongst the hypotheses. If they're very weak, I agree with Bing, you see weak results because you have a weak hypothesis in there. And so does that mean it's a bad instrument? No, it means that the comparison was not going to show the strength of the instrument. So maybe there's some hypothesis testing in a study that's really going to show the strength of the instrument, good or bad, but it's more related to that. And maybe we should be putting those further up on a ranking sheet when we're considering our appraisals.
Yeah.
And being explicit about that, like saying, you know, these are all the results that we had. We then looked at those that were looking specifically, if we're looking at the physical function example, those that were looking specifically at physical functioning and we're prioritizing those. Then we looked at the relationship with others that maybe were weaker hypotheses.
Yeah.
That's what we in the OMERACT worker productivity group with Suzanne try to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And the 75% rule, just as a reminder, is not an OMERACT provisional standard for all the reasons that we're talking about. So we're asking working groups to really think through the hypotheses and what conclusion they're making from it. So be explicit about it, but the 75% isn't a rule for us.
Excellent discussion, thank you. Just one other question that I keep getting asked as well is, do we still get a community vote for each instrument to pass the OMERACT filter?
So what happens is the working group comes up with the profile across the measurement properties, and then that naturally flows into a recommendation and endorsement level based on just an algorithm. It's just based on the pattern. Solid green, you get a green level of endorsement. So what we're asking the OMERACT community to do is to ratify that endorsement level. So they're ratifying, there's sort of like a second set of eyes saying, oh yeah, so you've clearly got the SOMP. They would have the detailed reporting tables if they wanted, but hopefully the SOMP becomes sort of recognizable that yes, you know, there's the solid green bar of profile. You should be able to look up each bar and see that there's multiple studies that are giving the indication of why that got a solid green endorsement rather than an amber. So all of that would be on the SOMP, and then the group is ratifying the SOMP. The tag would have a role in helping us to make sure that all the cells in the SOMP are accounted for in the documentation of the working group. So at the final stage before the ratification, the tag has a look at all the evidence that the group has gathered and says, yes, they did have all these studies. Yes, they did have the quality of methods done. So that's another good piece. So the community is just ratifying. They don't have to review the articles themselves. They're saying, yes, this looks like the right body of evidence to make this conclusion.
Awesome. And thank you, Dorcas. That was amazing and very informative. And I loved all the questions people. I think with 30 seconds left, I'll just say that June 18th is our next town hall, and George Wells is going to be talking about putting a composite through our filter. So that'll also be very interesting. And this recording will go up on the website as well as Dorcas's recording on the SOMP. So we're very happy to have these methods pieces. If you have any suggestions for later on in the fall, because we don't have them through the summer, please let us know and we can work on those as well.
What about construct validity, Bev? Would people be interested in having a discussion, more of an open one, about construct validity and bringing some of those hypotheses in? And
well, we had it for the worker
productivity group, yeah, and we had a small discussion with Bev and Andre and Casper about it. So hopefully some of the fellows take this further on as a piece of work within OMERACT as well. So yeah, we'll definitely work on the concept, because it's a very interesting topic where a lot of working groups seems to struggle with. So yeah, Casper and Andre are going to lead on some of that work as well.
Excellent.
Yeah. Maybe in the fall we can have an additional piece on that.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks everyone. And thank you so much, Dorcas, and all the questions are amazing. So very, very helpful.